Hello. So, just introducing today a new playlist that I put together. It's a curated playlist, profiling, particularly from the world of entertainment, a number of female to male um, portrayals, which may be of interest to some viewers. Now, admittedly, this isn't something that particularly interests me, and that may be largely down to my own projection as someone who is male embodied, and therefore my focus on transformation tends to be very much peaked, as it were. The interest tends to be peaked by examples of male to female, which perhaps I can project onto. However, I think it does raise an interesting question around what I suspect is a general view held in society. At least that's the way it feels to me, that it's less stigmatizing for women to dress as men, as at least traditionally it has been for men to dress as women. And I find that quite intriguing. Um, so, possibly to offer a few thoughts on why that may be. Um, it suggests to me that it's not specifically about, because there's that difference, about there being an insistence on us conforming to binary roles, but there's something to do with men particularly dressing in a way that is not seen as being appropriate. Now, these are not my personal beliefs, I should say, but these are just some ideas about why this may be the case. I think it's often thought that women are the peacock sex, at least in most cultures these days, and therefore most obviously highlight, play up, if you like, associations in terms of dress and appearance that point to their sex, and therefore men who dress as women are playing with that as well. They have more material, as it were, to draw on, makeup and adornments and so on being obvious examples. Whereas women who dress as men, generally speaking, are limited to how they wear their hair, in which, in certainly in Western culture, they have a lot of flexibility with anyway, and also their clothing. And again, in today's world, unisex clothing of kind of a masculine look clothing is very common. I think another reason that this difference may exist is that men traditionally have been seen, regarded as being ready to fight, particularly in hunter gatherer societies, ready to play their part to defend the tribe. And this pressure to be strong, masculine, as it's perceived, macho even, begins very early on in the playground. There'll be teasing for those who are seen as being effeminate, who are more interested in playing with the girls rather than taking risks. They'll stand out like um, blooded chickens, I think is the expression, red-blooded chickens. Whereas women who dress as men perhaps are less threatening to the tribe, at least that may be the way it's been seen traditionally, as they may still play some useful role, which may or may not include being a mother. In the patriarchy, um, there has long been social pressure in families to raise boys to be men, and indeed, having a boy child has been valued. The rules of primogeniture still exist in some cultures, as I understand it. Um, so this pressure on boys becoming men that parents perhaps put on them, perhaps particularly fathers, may be perceived to be in their own good, for their own survival, for their own opportunity to succeed in life, at least as it is perceived. Whereas perhaps women who portray tomboy attitudes, who want to adopt male traits, as it were, are seen as moving up the hierarchy in this gendered hierarchy that the patriarchy has created, not, as it were, downwards. As I say, that's not a view I personally hold. I'm very much a believer in equality, as I'm sure you know from other videos on this channel, but I'm just putting this forward as a view that may be out there. Another thought, body shaping involves perhaps metaphorically for men cutting off the sex, their vital physical organ, as it were, which is not necessary in the disguise for women who dress as men, even though they obviously have to bind to hold in the chest. And I suspect that old prejudices around the idea, very false ideas of transgenders, people being perverted, um, degenerate, gay, whatever associations have existed in the past still prevail to some extent in families who are particularly uneducated. Parents may feel let down by their children, again, falsely disappointed, concerned for them perhaps, and maybe through that concern, the worries about how they will be stigmatized as they grow older may be channeled as anger and as rejection as an extreme. I suspect that these prejudices, these deeply ingrained prejudices, are still there um, in many in many families, even if they're not as prevalent as they would have been perhaps several decades ago. And I think another reflection on this is if Western culture upholds feminine beauty as an ideal, as it often does in art, for example. And this is something I probably myself would relate to. Male to female transformation seems to work a magic that kind of converts the, let's say, hairy monster. I know there's masculine beauty as well, but this is putting it in very bold and extreme terms to make the point. The chrysalis turns into the butterfly, the beautiful creation. Now, looking online at some of the suggestions offered here, this was a little AI search on Perplexity. Similar sort of ideas coming up to ideas I have myself. Different social reactions resulting from this highly ingrained gender roles and stereotypes that seem to prevail. So the suggestion that there have been historically very rigidly defined roles, whilst those may be loosening now. And in that, in those definitions, a much more public role typically was seen for men. Males were associated with having power, strength, authority compared with women who were submissive and um, spend most of their time in the home. This was the traditional view. And so the prevailing patriarchal hierarchy came to value masculine traits over feminine. And if men dressed as women or behaved as women, they were perceived as relinquishing their social power and status in that hierarchy. And that, for some at least, was seen as a form of weakness. Conversely, women who dressed as men or behaved as men, not by all, by any stretch of the imagination, but at least by some, may have been perceived to be taking a step kind of up the hierarchy, as it were, or at least making a move towards empowerment. So, just a few thoughts there on the power of our dress and how we present, and how society, I believe, still continues very often to differentiate in its judgment of men and women who dress as the opposite, traditional opposite sex.